I want you to imagine a 1.5 horsepower motorcycle. Now, I want you to imagine riding that 1.5 horsepower motorcycle across the entire United States. Now, I want you to imagine riding across the United States on that 1.5 horsepower motorcycle at a time when about half of the roads were even available and almost all of your trip was virtually unrideable. So then you're forced to make the trip on things like railroad tracks or just pushing and pulling the bike. Now, if you think I couldn't keep going in describing the trials and tribulations faced by George Wyman in his trip across the United States, you're wrong. And having just made a trip from Oregon to Iowa, essentially halfway across the country in my Honda Odyssey, well, I find this story even more incredible. Cars have generally beat motorcycles to the punch in most areas, but when it comes to the great first transcontinental trip across the United States, motorcycles have them beat by just a few months. In order to understand the sheer gravity of this accomplishment, you have to understand where motorcycles were in 1903. We're talking about the very first production motorcycles, and though there was lots of innovation in these early years, still the 1902 motorcycle ridden across the country was nothing short of primitive. This is a 1902 California brand motor bicycle. Well, what you're seeing on screen right now is actually the Yale that's housed at the Wheels Through Time Museum, but it's essentially the same exact motorcycle. Yale bought the California company, and this is basically it. Now, I call it a motor bicycle because that's what they called it a lot of times. At this time, it was essentially a bicycle with a motor strapped to it with a few differences. A thin belt drive, along with the option to pedal, and that pedal was used also to start the motorcycle at this time. The bike would have featured a slightly reinforced front end, and I mean, other than that, that's pretty much it. A very simple, primitive single-cylinder engine with a large external flywheel, and again, just a smidge over 1 horsepower, maybe 1.25 or 1.5. But now that we've met the motorcycle, let's meet the main character in this incredible story, George Wyman, a 25-year-old bicycle racer and motorcycle enthusiast and just general motor vehicle enthusiast from San Francisco. George details his entire trip in multiple publications shortly after his ride, and it's nothing short of fascinating and inspiring. I'll link all 5 parts of the story in the description below so you guys can go read it. I would definitely recommend it. But he says things like this: I at once began to go up in the world. I knew I would go higher. Also, I knew my mount. I was traveling familiar ground. During the previous summer, I had made the journey on a California motor bicycle to Reno, Nevada, and knew that crossing the Sierras, even when helped by a motor, was not exactly a path of roses. But it was that tour, nonetheless, that fired me with desire to attempt this longer journey to become the first motorcyclist to ride from ocean to ocean. Wyman describes the motorcycle's performance for the first 13 miles as like clockwork, covering that distance in a little over an hour. Yes, that's about 13 miles an hour. But then the problems started. The terrain was all over the place, hilly, dodgy, muddy, sandy, and anytime George would start to relax and just sort of cruise on his motorbike, something would happen. He'd hit a patch of bad road and end up crashing, and he'd start breaking things. I mean, he started breaking things very early on. In this case, he broke his cycle meter, and then he also broke the glass on top of his oil cup for the motor. And to be honest, I don't know what that means. I don't know what an oil cup is, but it sounds bad. The crazy thing is, this guy would just duct tape things back together and head off. He was very confident in his own ability to keep this machine running. Now, as Wyman plodded on, you have to understand that he was paving the way for a trip like this. Much like a rock climber going on uncharted climbs and sort of creating a new path, this had never been done before. It wasn't even certain that it was even possible. It wasn't like now where, there's a few roads and a few highways that you take basically all the way across the country. I liken this to going across the country and turning off highways. See how long that takes you if you do that. Only taking back roads. But in this case, again, way worse. He would be so happy to be on our back roads. Now, this forced George to actually take railroads for about half of his entire journey, and he describes the ride as choppy but often more usable than the roads that were available, as railroads have to stay maintained and the ties are close together, close enough to make it work. But I just want you to imagine a 50-day journey in which about half of it is spent bouncing along on a suspensionless 1.5 horsepower motor bicycle, just rocking the teeth out of your head. George was on his way out of California towards the Sierras from basically sea level to 7,000 feet. And if you've ridden even a modern carbureted motorcycle at that height, you know how this can go. Motorcycles really struggle to breathe at this elevation, and even more so on this primitive technology. Grades also remain, and the little motor was compelled to work for its mixture. It chugged like a panting being up the mountains, and from Auburn to Colfax, 60 miles from Sacramento, where I halted for the night, the help of the pedals was necessary. Things were starting to get rough for our man, and then it started snowing. A lot. Obviously, he couldn't make the trip in like feet of snow, so George actually took his motorcycle down into the snow sheds and walked it about 50 miles per day to continue traveling, but sort of get out of the snow. And if you don't know what a snow shed is, essentially these were the enclosed buildings over top of the railroads across the mountains. Wyman describes the incredible sound of snow pelting down on the roofs as he walked his bike every day across the mountains in these snow sheds. Along the way, George lost his can of oil, so he started backtracking. I trudged back a mile and a half. Not an inch of ground or snow escaped search, and when at last a dark object met my gaze, I fairly bounded toward it. It was my oil. I think I now know at last a thrill of the joy experienced by the traveler on the desert who discovers an unsuspected pool. Once out of the snow sheds, he found himself confronted with a long stretch of deep snow with only one way through, and that was through it. So he grabbed his bike and started walking, straight into essentially a long stretch of snowdrift, falling all over the place, slipping and sliding and just basically trudging through snow, just dragging this little motorcycle. But he made it through. So now George was in Reno, and like other destinations along the way, George would just ask for directions for the best route east. There was no Google Maps. Hell, there probably wasn't even traditional maps. I'm kidding. There was definitely maps. Regardless, this shows that there really wasn't a clear path for a trip like this. He sort of just did it as he went. George ended up stuck in Reno for a while due to snow, and as a rather straight-laced fellow who didn't chew, smoke, or gamble, as he says, he found himself pretty bored. Remember, this is a time when the Great West, sort of the remains of the Wild West, this sort of desolate part of our country between the Midwest and the coast, well, this was gold country. A place like Reno was kind of like Vegas today. So he decided to hang out with his motorcycle. George spent this time overhauling his machine, as he says, and I'd like to imagine he did more than just a quick oil change. He probably at least did a top-end rebuild or maybe a full engine rebuild. People who rode motorcycles at this time, and especially long distance, had to be mechanics. You didn't just take off on a machine like this. There was no avoiding problems, and George clearly had complete confidence in his ability to keep this sort of primitive and simple machine running, and he obviously had lots of parts with him that he needed. Although I say he probably did a top-end rebuild, and now I realize that probably doesn't make much sense because this probably was a side valve engine. Yeah, so maybe he did a side-end rebuild. I don't know. Finally, George was able to be on his way, and though it had stopped snowing, he found himself in cloudy weather approaching the daunting Nevada desert. Now, having just traversed this land in a reliable modern van and with modern amenities like gas stations, even now, the gas stations are pretty spread out. It's a bit scary just driving through this part of the country, going through the desert, knowing that if you break down, you're potentially, hours away from like any sort of civilization. Now imagine at this time how truly brave you would have to be to take off across the desert on this kind of motorcycle. Sand in Nevada means stuff in which you sink up to your ankles every time you attempt to take a step. To further enliven matters, it began to rain. Every now and then I had to dismount and walk for a stretch of a quarter of a mile. Several times the soft sand threw me because I did not respect it enough to dismount in time. A bicycle with a 6-horsepower motor could not get through such sand. The wheel just swings out from under, and the faster you try to go, the worse it is. Walking and riding, I managed, however, to make the 36 miles from Reno to Wadsworth in 4 hours, and there I pitched camp for the night. Wyman reminds us of the kinds of places he would stop and stay. He would say that these weren't really cities or even really towns. They were just places, he called them. And he was like, you can't even really call them places, where there's virtually nothing but a few houses. And listen, it hasn't changed much since 1903. If you've gone across this part of the country, even through like Wyoming, not just Nevada, you know that there's not much anywhere. Wyman's path across the desert all the way to Omaha actually was following the railroad tracks like the Union Pacific, again, often directly on the railroad. George calls much of this area God-forsaken country. Again, if you've made this trip and you've experienced how long it is and how boring it is, you understand. One finds it hard to picture in the mind what meadows and pasture land and brooks and trees are like. It is not strange that men go mad in a waste of sand so broad that to the eye it is as limitless as the sky, so dead that one feels a thrill of relief at the sight of a lizard or a swooping vulture. The wonder is that any man can see it and afterward be sane. 1 or 2 vultures were all the flying I saw in this section in all my long, lonely bouncing over the ties. George came out of the desert in Nevada a bit weary but much more tan, having lost his second cyclometer from the bumpy road, so onward he went, stopping for breaks and often to pass the time, practicing his marksmanship with his revolver, usually on roaming coyotes, or as he describes it being pronounced in this part of the country, coyote. George's first really nasty crash happened heading up Battle Mountain. His handlebar broke while he was riding and he fell off the bike, nearly striking his head on one of the railroad ties. And up the road he found a lineman, basically somebody who works on the railroads, to help him fashion a makeshift handlebar out of wood, which he used for hundreds of miles till he would be able to find a bicycle store in sort of a larger city. And at this point, George was really starting to have some real sort of inner turmoil and battles. To tell the whole truth, I went to bed thoroughly disgusted with my bargain. I felt as if I was a fool for attempting to cross the continent on a motor bicycle. I was tired of sand and sagebrush and railroad ties, my back ached, and I fell asleep feeling as if I did not care whether I ever reported to the motorcycle magazine in New York or not. In the morning, it was different, and I was determined as ever to finish the task and was eager to be off. But Wyman still had the big desert ahead of him, the Great American Desert, as he calls it, across Nevada and Utah. Wyman experienced everything: crashes, cold, heat. The only thing he successfully avoided on this journey was, good old-fashioned shootouts, which he was thankful for. Before reaching the Rockies, he found his stride, sometimes knocking out 100 miles in one day, always in awe of how his motorcycle held up. The hardest part was having to replace wheel spokes constantly from the rattling railroad ties. He would ride for 50 miles, and then he'd have like 4 spokes missing from each wheel. In Ogden, Utah, he was finally able to get a real set of handlebars installed, and he was on his way up into the Rockies. Now, up the Rockies, George traversed multiple streams, at first taking his shoes off and pulling his pants up as he walked, his motorcycle through the water, but ultimately, he would just leave everything on. He went through like 13 or 14 different streams, just pushing his bike through a foot of water at points. And this actually cooled the motorcycle's engine off, which is good, but at points too much. Like, it got so cold that it made it almost impossible for him to start it once he was out of the water. Over and through rocks and canyons and ultimately into farmland. At one point, Wyman had a little bit of an incident with a farmer. The farmers seemed to think I had no right on the road when they wanted to use it, and several swore as they called to me to get out of the way. One man abused me roundly and told me I ought to get off the road altogether with my damned bicycle. I did an indiscreet thing in answering him in kind, and he pulled up his team with the intention of getting off and horsewhipping me, or to get a steady position to take a pot shot at me with a revolver. I don't know which. I didn't stop to learn. I let out my motor and quickly got around a bend in the road out of sight and kept going, so that he did not see me again. I felt that tempers are too uncertain in that part of the country to risk a row with a native. I was alone in the land of the Mormons, and they are famed for the way they stick to one of their clan. When George would tell people about what he was doing, most of them didn't believe him, and they didn't believe his intentions to travel all the way to New York from San Francisco. I find a variable reception in this country to my statement that I have journeyed from San Francisco and am bound for New York. A great many do not believe me and smile as if amused by an impromptu yarn. There is another class, though, that of the old settlers, the real mountaineers, who have had adventures of all sorts in the mountains and the wilderness. These men are surprised at nothing, and they rather nettle me by accepting me and my motor bicycle and my statement with utmost stolidity, as if the feat was commonplace. For a while I thought that this class too were unbelievers, but later I learned that as a rule they are the only ones who do believe me, because they are men who believe anything possible in the way of overland journeying. Through Wyoming he made good travel, besides having to pedal across the railroads due to conditions. For 43 miles I had to pedal. If you ever went for a ride on a tandem and took your best girl or some other fellow's best girl and she was a heavyweight, and about 30 miles from home she gave out and you had to do all the pushing to get home, you have a slight idea how I felt pushing the motor over the railroad ties. In Nebraska, Wyman had to deal with wild dogs yipping at him, and ultimately he was almost hit by a train, but he kept up and kept going across the Midwest. From the Midwestern state of Iowa all the way up to New York, and Iowa is my home state, by the way, so it's actually kind of interesting where he went. Anyways, he was on muddy, wet dirt roads. Apparently, this part of the country was experiencing record rains. Midwestern spring rains can be that way, and it can sometimes last well into the summer. So you would think it wouldn't be raining at this point in, say, June, but it will be sometimes. Some of Wyman's descriptions may seem like exaggeration, but then you see his pictures and you realize what he was dealing with. Every few miles, in this case, he'd have to kick all of the caked mud off of his tires, but perhaps even more difficult was the constant ridicule from people who just at this point and in this part of the country didn't understand motorcycles. You have to remember how new these were. And with motorcycles, it was much like any new innovation. You have sort of the coast of the country, whether it's the east or west coast, experiencing the new stuff, and then it sort of trickles down to the Midwest. That's kind of how all of culture works in the United States, at least new things, Something will happen on the coast and then the Midwest will get it like a year later. People would say, why don't you just ride it, when they saw him pushing it through mud? And he would get frustrated. He'd be like, people don't realize you can't just ride this like motor bicycle in any terrain. But you do get a sense reading through his story that he pushed this thing pretty much just as much as he rode it, which is almost even more impressive. Wyman describes arriving at Clinton from Cedar Rapids, no doubt crossing my hometown of DeWitt, Iowa, by way of Old Highway 30, which runs right through town. It's crazy to think that he rode the way where I spent much of my adolescence and where I was just riding my dad's old motorcycle, for example, and my mom's old moped this summer. Once in Chicago, having pedaled most of that road from Clinton, Wyman had to wait for an important part to be telegraphed to him, in this case, a crank. So, yeah, kind of important. Now, the final part of Wyman's story details his trip from Chicago in the Midwest, up the lakes, and to New York. People in this part of the country, especially the Midwest, were obsessed with George on his motor bicycle. Crowds would surround him wherever he went. Young boys wanted him to take it all apart and show him how it worked because this was just such new technology, just motor vehicles in general. Often he would have to haul it in, like inside with him to his room to stay overnight because he was afraid that someone was going to just nab it. Now, the actual sort of natural terrain of this leg of the trip should have been better, and that wasn't really the problem at this point. Wyman was now facing ongoing problems with his motorcycle, and it wasn't the bike's fault. He had just beaten the poor thing up so much, and problems upon problems were arising. It also didn't help that sometimes George would get gas, and then it wasn't actually gas, like it would be some weird concoction of various oils that didn't do much good for the bike. But things like loose screws in the crankcase and tearing drive belts. First it was the oil and then the belt, and I became so disgusted before noon that I felt like shooting the whole machine full of holes and deserting it. Once into New York State, more problems arose. It took a total of 8 days for George to get his bike from the state line of New York into New York City. The bike was essentially falling apart at this point, to the point where George really couldn't even repair it. Broken forks, parts just literally falling off. At one point, the belt for the bike, like the drive belt, broke 5 times in 1 mile because the crank wasn't sort of turning true, and so it just kept tearing it. Then the handlebars broke again, a piston ring was worn, causing the piston to squeak loudly. George was not happy at this point. Some of the remarks I made to myself as I walked were not fit for quoting to a Sunday school class. Now, he finished his trip in some of the most beautiful terrain that he'd experienced so far. Having driven from Iowa up to the Northeast and going through New York, I can concur. The hills and the trees, it's just beautiful. It's dense and sort of wild and amazing. And he wasn't even there in the fall. That's really when you want to drive through the beautiful parts of New York. But because of his broken cycle meters along the way, George wasn't able to calculate his exact distance traveled, but it was at least 3,800 miles. And listen to how he ends the final part of his article in the Motorcycle magazine. While it is true that my forks broke and the motor crank axle also gave way, these are unusual accidents. Nearly all of my other troubles were minor ones, the belt being a most prolific source. But as a whole, the motor behaved splendidly and performed its work well under many trying conditions. Its failure at Albany was really the only occasion when it gave me serious concern. Subsequent examination proved that the inlet valve had in some way become jammed so as to be immovable, at least with the means at my command. Between fear of breaking something and anxiety to reach New York, I possibly did not take the chances of making a strenuous repair that under other circumstances I would have taken. Save the forks, the bicycle also stood up well. The wonder is that it stood up at all. So terrific and so frequent was the pounding it received in the many miles of cross-tie travel. The saddle, too, deserves praise. Despite its many drenchings and mud and the heat of the desert and the banging of the railroad ties, it did not stretch or sag the fractional part of an inch and reach New York in as good a condition as when it left San Francisco. George Wyman truly is the Lindbergh of motorcycle touring and really long-distance motor traveling of any kind. In the history of great motorcycle adventures, this one stands among the greatest, not because of the distance traveled, but more because of the circumstances, the time in which it was done, and the machine that was used. But for me, reading his story, I see that it's the same story as any long-distance motorcycle trip. Of course, most of the time you're not pushing your motorcycle down the railroad tracks and through the desert and, through streams. But it's more about the stories along the way, overcoming the difficulties, meeting new people and making memories, and really overcoming that feeling of not being able to complete your trip. I think we should all remember this story. Whenever you're sore from a long ride or you aren't enjoying the road or, your bike breaks down, just remember, odds are that whatever you're facing, you don't have it as bad as George did.